everyone non-Australian were the same thing. So it didn't matter, like 1 week I'd turn up for, I thought, well, Greek roles, but it didn't matter. It could have been Italians, Jews, Spanish, Arabs, Sri Lankan. It just didn't matter. As long as you didn't look Australian, it was okay. It wasn't okay, but it was just everyone else was foreign. Now, I think that's changed a bit over the years, that we now sort of realise that there maybe is a difference between Arabs and Greeks or whatever. But and that's pretty well across the board. It's a bit more liberal in theatre, that you get away with more. You can be cast in more things in theatre, but not that much has changed in television. And just recently I had to fill out a bio and just sort of reduce it down to like 10 main parts. And I noticed that the 10 main parts that ranged over TV and film and theatre. And it had the characters' name. It wasn't until I got to the end of it and I looked at the characters' names and they were all WOG names. That really, in terms of substantial work, I hadn't played anything that was Anglo-Australian. Not surprisingly, I guess, but that I suddenly thought, gee, 25 years, I've just really been playing WOGs, basically. There was a period during the 70s, I guess, or early 70s, where I had very long hair and I could sort of pass as a hippie, and I could play other things. I could get to play hippies or something, or drug addicts or something. But it was just basically WOGs.
And did you sense that? That's not only a reflection on what's going on, but did people in the industry say those sorts of things to you?
Oh yeah. The polite ones would try to say, oh, well, you just don't look right, or we had something else in mind, But the more honest ones would say, well, you just don't look Australian. That was always, I thought, well, I'm born here, I don't know what else I can be. I guess, it was, the worst part, I suppose, was working in theatre where I didn't really expect it. And there was one, I remember I was doing a season of shows at MTC and at Melbourne Theatre Company, and got a bad review for something. And it wasn't the fact that I'd gotten a bad review that bothered me, because that happens to everyone and you get sort of used to that early on. And stuff, but it was the fact that the reviewer had said, that I was MTC's token ethnic. Mm-hmm. And I thought, oh shit, is that really the only reason I've got this job? Is because they feel they want to be seen to be employing an ethnic, and I just felt really, really bad about that. But generally in TV they've been pretty honest about it, and I must admit that having cast a lot of things, being a director and casting film and television and stuff like that, it is very hard to tell actors that they're not right for a job. I remember casting a female lead in a telly movie, and we must have seen, the producer and casting director and myself, we must have seen, I don't know, 24 actresses, all of whom would have been fine for it. They there was no doubting their ability. They could have all played it. And I really realised then that only one of them was going to play it, and I really had to find something to say to the other 23. And there was nothing I could say other than, I just didn't think you were right for it. And it's hard to go beyond that. But I guess the difference was, I wasn't judging them in terms of their physical attributes, their appearance. In that sense, it was more, on sort of emotional qualities and things like that.
But do you feel that your imagination as a director encompasses a wider range of possibilities for a part, say, than an Anglo-Australian director facing the same sort of job?
Well, I don't know that I can really. All I can say, speaking for myself, is that it would never really occur to me unless there was some really strong plot point that required the person to have blonde hair and blue eyes. I can't imagine that I would just think in those terms. And certainly in the example I quoted, the range of physical appearances of the actresses we saw would have encompassed everything. So I don't think I've ever really concentrated on a physical type in the way that I feel has happened to a lot of non-Anglo actors.
Well, thinking back over your own career, can you think of parts that you've played and scripts that you've worked on that really capture for you, if you like, a sort of a reality of Australian society and that diversity, ones that ring true?
Certainly in terms of theatre, Dorothy Hewitt's play Fields of Heaven certainly did, and the character was an Italian migrant in the sort of 20s, 30s, and I thought Dorothy really had. I think she's such a wonderful writer, and she really had captured the real sort of alienation that people feel, and she really captured the sort of unconscious hostility of the host nation, because I believe a lot of it is unconscious. I mean, there's heaps of it that is conscious as well, and so I thought that was a really good example of it. And that, in terms of work, I found that really satisfying. I mean, in odd ways, I guess. There were times during Kingswood Country where I actually thought that hit upon something, and I don't know whether that was a conscious thing or not. And I mean, I still feel ambivalent about the way it was handled, but I certainly thought, and I suppose because that was the first real that sort of popular exposure on commercial TV that leads to a certain sort of supermarket fame. That's where I really started to get feedback from kids, basically, who'd come up and, who were obviously non-Anglo kids. And it obviously, there was a point of identification there. And so, I mean, I think there were areas of that felt all right. I mean, I think there have been smaller things like, I think, just small things like Last Days of Shane New, Helen Garner's film, and the character in that, and I just thought she'd captured a certain sort of, and I mean, I think even though it's made in Sydney, I thought it was a really very much a Melbourne sort of film, and I think, and whenever I see the film, it looks to me like a Melbourne film made in Sydney. But and certainly the character in that, a really minor part, but I thought she'd actually really captured a sort of feel for that sort of inner city Melbourne Greek Australian. Yeah.
What about the other sorts of shows that have been around? I mean, like the Live and Sweaty and that sort of stuff.
Well, Live and Sweaty, I'm not quite sure how much ethnicity had to do with that, other than the fact that I mean, for the right sorts of reasons, I think the ABC were trying to be seen to be using people outside of a wider gene pool than just the...
Yeah, well, both of you, both the leads in that were non-Anglos, but they were dealing heavily with a sort of classical Anglo-Australian... Yeah.
Well, I suppose I enjoyed it because, for that sort of reason, that it actually... and I suppose I was able to use it to soapbox a bit on stuff I wanted to say as well. So I mean, I guess I tried to glorify non-Anglo Australia and stuff in a stupid, really sort of dickhead sort of way. But I mean, I sort of enjoyed that, and certainly in that and debates and stuff like that. I mean, I was very conscious of having an opportunity to. Because you can basically editorialise, you didn't have to stick to anyone's script, and because it was ad-lib, that there really was a chance to continually remind people, if they needed any reminding, not just that I was Greek, but there were plenty of other people out there who weren't from just the Anglo mainstream.
What sort of feedback have you had, say, from the Greek communities about your representation of that?
Well, pretty good. Generally, pretty good. I don't know. I guess my relationship to the community is a bit. I mean, I know they're sort of proud of me generally, that they'd like to see in much the same way as I do. I mean, if I see the football and I see a Greek guy there, I make sure I mention that he's in the team. Or if I see a movie that's got a Greek actor in it or something like that, I make sure I make it. So I'm proud when I see Greeks doing stuff as well. Not just Greeks, but as an example. So I mean, the feedback from them has been very good and very positive, and I think it's a funny sort of thing with Greeks because there have always been so many Greeks who have lived outside of Greece that I often feel when I'm back in Greece that there is a tendency that Greeks have a tendency anyway to define themselves in terms of those who achieve outside of the country. And I think that's not always a healthy thing in terms of being back in Greece. And I think that happens in most in most communities. I mean, certainly the first generation who have had a pretty tough time here, I think they deserve to have symbols that their effort hasn't been in vain, that it was worth putting up with all those horrible, awful hours in factories and cafes and stuff like that. And so, you know, and so when the kids get educated and become doctors and stuff like that, I think they're justifiably proud of them. And it can be a little bit overbearing because you sort of feel that you do have a responsibility as well. And I've sort of felt that from time to time, that there'd been occasions where I thought, oh, you know, I can't really do what I want to do because I'm sort of representing the Greek community a bit. Not that they've asked me to represent them, but I've just sort of...
You feel you carry that with someone?
Well, a bit, yeah. You just sort of feel a little bit responsible. But that's a small price to pay for the sort of almost unconditional support you get from the community as well. And that in itself is, you know, there are times when, I'm like, that's a great comfort, you know, to get into cabs and stuff like that and just be able to, and just, you know, and I mean, it makes you feel good.
Yeah.
You know, when the cab drivers say that they see you on TV or whatever, what they know who I am or something. It's good, you know, and maybe they know my folks and stuff like that, so we chat about that. It's good.
Can I just, on this final note on this part of it, thinking about stuff that is currently on air or recently been made as film and so on, not necessarily stuff you've been involved in yourself, can you think of, or would you think of any that, if you were saying to kids 15, 16, look, this is the sort of thing that Australian culture should be producing, this is coming to grips with what we're really about, what would you?
Gee, I find that a bit hard because I don't know that I've seen, I'm not sure that I've seen any stuff that I really think has been fantastic in that area. Other than the fact that I think, I mean, you know, the fact that George Miller of Mad Max fame, Paul Cox, Carl Schultz, all those people have made movies of really high quality. I mean, I guess Anna Kokinos's film, Only the Brave, I think it's a fantastic film, and I think that really, I mean, I think that has a lot to say about what it's like to be, you know, to be a young girl growing up from a Greek family in Melbourne's western suburbs. And I think, you know, in many ways, I think the way, you know, that art, the more specific it is, the more universal become the implications of it. And I think she's so specifically correct about that area of Melbourne and that sort of you know, contemporary young woman in that society, that I think that's a movie that does have real cross-cultural values about it, and I think it's a fantastic movie. So that would be unqualified. Give that as an example, yeah.
Okay, well, can we move then into one of the more controversial areas of the whole multicultural thing, which is comedy, which you've had some little bit to do with.
Yeah.
Over the last decade or so, there's been a rise really in the range and number of comics from non-English speaking backgrounds who focus on ethnicity as the sort of the framework in which they're working. Why do you think that's happened, and how do you respond to that sort of comedy?
I think it's happened because I think comedy is, I think we're going to be invaded by kids and dogs now.
Okay.
Yeah. I think part of the reason it's happened is that comedy is always a really good weapon to diffuse potentially hostile situations. You know, I think if you're about to get belted, you know, it's if you can make the aggressor laugh or diffuse the situation, I think it's good. But it's also, I think it's traditionally been a weapon of oppressed classes wherever, in order to come to terms with their situation, because if you don't find the jokes about it, then I think you're bound to go under, basically. So it's not surprising that a lot of second generation comedians have grown up here and are now starting to express themselves that way. And you know, there's heaps of them. Ostentatious, I know Rachel Berger, Vince Sorrenti, George Smilovich, Hung Lee, and I'm bound to have missed out several. But I think all of them. And I think also comedy relies on a point of view that is from the outside. I think there's comedy requires a certain objectivity, and certainly if you're if you're a migrant kid, then you spend a lot of your time on the outside, and you really are. It gives you a chance to look at from a distance at this subject, and I think.
So do you think it's the other side of the alienation?
I think so, yeah, and I think the moment you do look at it from a distance, then it becomes funny, and I mean Vince Sorrenti, I remember talking to him, and he at one point he had some gigs in Italy, the homeland of his parents, and one of them was to a group of Australian tourists, and his opening line was, "Why don't you all go back to where you came from?" And he said he'd been waiting 30 years to say that, and so I think that sort of encapsulates it for me. I think the way it's translated to television has not been good at all. I mean, I don't really like the way it's translated to television, because it feels to me that it's only ever become acceptable to mainstream television while ever it perpetuates the sort of stereotypes that mainstream society feels comfortable with. So while I thought Wogs Out of Work was a terrific small cabaret show, I think as it translated to television and then became the big commercial theatre success, I think that really, I'm uneasy about it, and good luck to Nick for making all that money. I don't begrudge him that at all, but I think it has involved perpetuating images that mainstream society is comfortable with. You know, there's not a lot different, I believe there's not a lot of difference between, say, the taxi driver that Nick does and the Con the Fruiterer that Mark Mitchell used to do. You know, I mean in terms of characterisation and what it's saying, I don't think there's a great deal of difference to them. I suppose in Nick's case he has more legitimacy because he's drawing on his own background, whereas the Mark Mitchell example I just find offensive. You know, it's almost like a Demidенko. You know, if he'd called himself Mark Demidenko and then been exposed for Mark Mitchell, I think we would have all killed him. You know, and he's sort of got away with it in that sense. So I don't think there's I don't think mainstream media has embraced diversity in that sense at all.
Is it because they're uncomfortable, or is it simply a marketing question? You know, that they believe that their audiences will only accept stuff which is stereotypical and demeaning of minorities?
Well, I believe that's the case. Yes, I believe it is because commercial television is inherently conservative, and they're pitching to the largest slice of the market. I mean, I think the argument is more, would you necessarily lose that majority of the market if you did it correctly? And I don't believe that there's any evidence to say that you would.
Because it's truly something to do with authenticity.
Well, absolutely, and I mean, I think in many ways, you know, in an odd way, it's almost like the commercials themselves are actually being more adventurous in a sense of diversity than mainstream programming is. And the irony of it is, I guess, that we don't, you know, that we readily accept American drama and British drama, which utilises diversity, and we don't question that. I mean, the #1 drama show is NYPD Blue, and we don't question the fact that you know the two principal cops are called Bobby Simone and Sipowicz.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, but we've had a long tradition of accepting cop shows like Columbo and Banachek and all that sort of stuff, and that's fine. You know, but I don't see it happening here. I don't see anyone saying, why don't we do that here? Because we're still not comfortable with that sort of thing. And it's an educational thing. There is still that fear of the unknown. Everyone wants to be comfortable.
I suppose one of the arguments that's been put forward about that is that the crucial problem in Australian media in relationship to minorities is the writers. That we haven't got the writers to produce the characters which are authentic enough to be carried forward. That the Anglo writers can't produce authentic characters because they don't understand them.
Well, I think that's...
The minority writers aren't around.
Well, I think the first part is true, but I think the second part is not. I think there are... I mean, our tradition our prose tradition would say that over the last 20 years there have been heaps of writers around. Now, whether those... What are we saying? That non-Anglos simply write prose, that they don't experiment with drama at all? I find that hard to believe because most of them come from cultural traditions which embrace drama. So I think, well, it can't be that. Are they not getting the opportunities? I don't know. I don't know what the case is, but certainly, you look at our fiction writers, and there is no dearth of writers from non-Anglo backgrounds. Now, why that hasn't been translated into theatre and from there to TV and film, I have no idea, and I can only assume that. I'm sure there are other examples, but with the exception of Giannis Bolotis, I'm not sure that there are that many writers who have had opportunities at theatre companies. It tends to be they tend to be relegated to community arts, as though that's a lesser place, and that's the proper place for a non-Anglo writer to be. And I don't see any, but then I don't see a lot of Australian writing being encouraged anyway. So it's a bit difficult if you're a minority within a minority itself. I don't know how you ever get that sort of exposure that would be required. But certainly there is. I don't think there's a dearth of writers. I think there's a dearth of desire to find those writers. That's what it comes down to. Was that the question?
Yeah. Well, that brings us in fact, to the third part of the story. You've now you've got involved over the last few years in, if you like, multicultural policy stuff. How did that come about?
Well, I'm not quite sure. I don't really know, except I suppose that I had I suppose it came about through television exposure, and the fact that there were certain values that I would question, I suppose, in interviews. I guess I'd been well enough brought up, and I'd been fortunate enough to have an education to realise that there were certain things that in the society that didn't feel right, and I guess I gradually became more and more confident about articulating that, and I guess from that point of view, people started to then ask my opinion on things, and I suppose in that sense, as I studied it more and more and saw more and more where the discrepancies lay and how unequal it is, I guess through that I'd start to. Well, I suppose I'd always had a political interest in it anyway. And so I can date that back to kindergarten virtually, because I always felt it was odd that we had the symbols that were, the icons of Australia that were being shown were not ones that were within my experience whatsoever, and I didn't understand why that should make me any less an Australian than anyone else who was born here. And I could see the way my father was treated and stuff like that, and how embarrassed I would be if he came to school, and I thought, oh God, he's going to talk in Greek, and all those classic things like, what am I going to have to eat? Why can't I just have soggy tomato sandwiches like everyone else? Why do I have to eat all this fantastic food when I could be having Vegemite? So like as a kid, I knew that it was not quite. I knew that Australia comprised of two different worlds. I knew that the food that we ate at the cafe was different than the food we served the customers, and I could never work out why. I knew that the coffee we drank, or that my grandfather and father drank, was different than the pots of tea we served, and I couldn't. And always I'd wondered why there was that difference and why it should be. And I suppose as I got older and started to understand and then started to be able to articulate it a bit and then study more, and that I guess just became something that I was interested in. And then I guess people would ask my opinion on it, I suppose. Or if I saw something that I didn't like, I suppose I would say so.
And so your first official appointment was to the Multicultural Advisory Council?
Well, I guess the Multicultural Advisory Council was the first one in that sense, although over the years I've done a number of been on smaller committees and, within Actors Equity and those sort of areas, often on judging panels or arts panels to do with, when ethnic TV, as it was called prior to SBS, was being set up, and those sort of things. So I guess I'd always been on the outskirts of it. And
can I just ask, and this is sort of to the side, but it's an interesting moment. When you were involved in that, did you have anything to do with Petro Georgiou?
Not a great deal, no. No. No, other than he was around and sort of was pushing it a bit and stuff. But I mean, I guess also in those days that I mean, because I remember you were around then. I mean, I guess it was just there was a feeling of unity. Simply, I mean, it was almost as though people didn't have any differences because we were so grateful to get the opportunity to get something happen. It was like we were scared to show that there were any differences within groups because we didn't want to think, God, if they see us arguing, then
It's the end of everything.
then it's the, so we better all behave and look responsible, like we can get on and do it and everything, and which still operates to an extent, and it still tends to be the way we, it still tends to be the way we treat most groups, like we treat the Vietnamese, or that we treat the indigenous population or whatever. We tend to think they're all going to subscribe to one point of view, and if they don't, God forbid, there should be differing opinions. We say, see, I told you they couldn't do it.
That's right. The ethnic gene hasn't been programmed correctly.
Exactly. Yeah. See, you put them in charge. Look what happens. They argue.
That's right.
Yeah.
So coming back to your current experience, how do you see the work of something like the Multicultural Advisory Council?
Well, I think it also is a little bit like that. I mean, I think the importance is to embrace that we need to be seen to really be giving a realistic appraisal of where Australia is at the moment in terms of multiculturalism, and the fact that it is now an influence in every possible strata of society. That there is representation there, but to a varying degree, and in hardly any areas is that representation over-representation. That in most areas there are still questions of access and equity. And it still comes back to the fact that if we are to be the society that all the rhetoric says we are, and the rhetoric's fabulous, and I'm as much into it as anyone. I love it. But it can only ever be rhetoric while there is such a gap between that and the reality. And unless we can close that gap, then the rhetoric is just that, it's bullshit. And it sounds great, but we can't take it seriously. Now, either we make a commitment to taking it seriously, and if we do, then that does mean that we have to set up programs where access and equity are genuine and achievable things, where we don't just talk about it, but we actually do try and find ways to do it. And it's always like just put off, say, well, gee, it'd be good to do it this time, but this time we better, the committee will really need to be set up this way, but we must bear that in mind. We must remember next time that it should be a bit more proportional. And you think, well, why don't we do it this time? Because, but there's not enough trained people around, not enough people with experience. You think, well, how are they going to get the experience?
What would you see as the most immediate challenges then from your experience? What are the things? Where are the areas that you had to pick, say, 3 or 4 that you say, okay, now let's go out and really
politics.
Mm-hmm.
That's the main area, because that's ultimately where you're going to get things changed. You're going to get changed by numbers. You've just got to have the votes, and the fact that it's not just the ethnics, obviously the women as well. The underrepresentation is so severe that it'll never really change unless you have enough people in there who are from different backgrounds that they can say, hang on, this doesn't apply to us, this is not going to help me, this is not going to help my family or the people I know or my parents and stuff like that. I think that's the level it has to change at. I mean, there are all sorts of other areas, and obviously I think the media is a crucial area because of the stories it tells, because of the images it gives us, because of the messages it sends both domestically and internationally. I mean, those messages are crucial, and the media is still, the overall impression I have of the media is that it's by Anglos for Anglos. I believe that's who they think they're talking to, and that's certainly who's doing the talking.
And do you think the government can actually engage with that?
Well, I think it should. I think it should, and it's really difficult because it's a very you know, it's a real Bolshevik sort of thing, because how do you regulate commercial television?
Well, does it even the commercial television? I mean, the ABC hasn't had a non-English speaking background board member since Labour came to power.
Yeah.
Right, sorry.
Who's it, bad?
Yeah, I was just saying that the government. I mean, the government seems to have failed to do that over a period of time. And one's wondering what sort of messages you're getting inside these major advisory councils about what the real agendas are.
Well, I think certainly ABC and SBS, I think, are both underachieving at the moment in that area, and I think in ABC's case it's because there is still very much a power structure there that is, you know, it's still a boys' club. It's still a white Anglo middle class, middle-aged boys' club, and you know, SBS has been set up along those lines a bit itself. And so not surprisingly, I think that's reflected a bit at SBS as well. In terms of, now, I don't know that there's a conscious agenda that is allowing that to happen, but what I'm sure is, what I feel certain is that there is nothing actively happening to make that change. Now, and once again, it comes back to the rhetoric. The rhetoric is fine, but I don't sense a real commitment toward making that change. You know, and it's got to change because people are being made to change. You know, if they can't embrace the concept willingly, if our education system is so poor that it still doesn't embrace any sort of multicultural education, very sort of tokenistic indigenous education. You know, it's still primarily, you know, we're still talking about the First Fleet and stuff like that. You know. You know, I think because the education system has fallen behind, or just hasn't been able to deal with it in that area. I mean, it just, you know, we keep producing institutions that don't have a real sense of why they should be making this commitment, why this commitment is important. It's still as though it's, you know, they're institutions that were set up a certain way and they shouldn't have to change. And all we're saying is that the society has changed, and if those institutions are going to be relevant to the society and actually be functional and perform and be part of it, then they have to change as the society has. And very little has embraced that. I mean, we still have the same sort of icons. I mean, we still have, you know, we still have a flag that now has such a ludicrously outdated symbolism that it's almost impossible to look at it without giggling, to understand. I mean, I can understand why it was there once, but why it should be there still now for 30% of the population for whom it is like, you just look at it and you think, what does it mean? Or you go overseas and people say, why have you got that in your flag? And you say, well, I don't know. I can't answer that question. You know, so to make all those sort of institutional changes, you know, not just the icons, but to stop the institutions thinking that way is really difficult, because none of them have, you know, it comes back to the politics, none of them have any sort of boards that reflect that sort of thing, you know, where the power is.
But it's 50 years, isn't it, really,
well,
since post-war migration began. I mean, this is the 50th anniversary.
Yeah, but we didn't think they'd stay here. God, we didn't think they'd stay here and want to build homes here and have kids here and send the kids to universities and, you know, and what a piece of the action. We thought they were just going to come out here and be cheap labour, you know, and what have they done?
So they stuck around.
Yeah.
So, I mean, do you see, for instance, one of the major goals of something like the Multicultural Advisory Council has been to change the participation in the power structure? I mean, is this something?
I think, well, it's one of my major goals. I wouldn't want to speak for the rest of the council, all of whom may have different opinions on that, but certainly for me it is, because I mean, in many ways I think we're in a new phase, and I think the earlier phase was to make sure that people could live comfortably within their own communities and not be persecuted for it, and still have a reasonable life. I think to an extent that has happened. I think there's still work to be done in that area, but I think it is now further than that. It now means that that's not good enough anymore, because wherever we do that, in a sense we perpetuate that sort of marginalisation. And I think now the effort is to say, well, that's fine, but we actually want to participate. We actually want to have a go here. We want to have the same opportunities in these sort of areas as well. And so that's where I think that, and those sort of things can only happen with participation at decision-making level. Unless you have that, it doesn't matter who you are, unless you have some sort of participation at that level, you're not going to get anything. You know, you're constantly going to be depending on what crumbs you get handed, rather than actually being part of the process that is making those decisions. While your destiny is dependent upon others, I don't think you can really expect that other people are really going to look after you in the way that you would look after yourself.
So how do you bring that about?
Well, you just agitate and you become a pain in the bum, and you know, you keep questioning, you keep saying, why does your board have so many members? Why is the composition of it in such a way? Why is it like this? Why don't you employ these sort of people? You know, in terms of actors, you say, why aren't you employing non-Anglo actors? Why are they so badly underrepresented? Why does the board of your theatre company not have any non-Anglo representation? Who chooses the plays you do? Who casts the actors? Who are the directors of the plays you do? Why aren't you using people in these sort of areas? Because you can't say that they're not around. You know, the old argument would say there are no trained actors here, which was not true, but it was a convenient sort of myth for a while. Well, that doesn't exist anymore because there are trained actors here. Because there are trained actors here, and there's no excuse not to use them. So now you have to come up with a better excuse as to why they're not getting a go. And I suppose that's the only way to change it is keep challenging it. And certainly if there's a position where, and I think the one genuine area that you can challenge that is where public funding is involved. If something is funded publicly, if it is using taxpayers' money, and that's all the taxpayers' money, then they have a right to say how that money is spent. They have a right to see where the money goes, and they have a right to be represented in the way that money is spent. I can't see an argument against that. So I mean, you know, if it's someone else's money, I guess they can do what they like with it. But you know, you can still say it's not good enough. But there's no excuse for not providing representation with public funding.
Okay, well I think that probably brings me to the end of the range.
All right, that's sort of what.
Yeah, no, that was great. Unless you want to tell a joke. You want to tell a joke?
I don't know many jokes.
You don't know many jokes?
Very good jokes.
Think of a joke.
I've got a joke. It's here somewhere. Yeah, help me find it.
And the
It was a
joke?
Looney cartoon.
Right.
Of Multicultural. No, I can't find it. Yeah, you better button off. So there's this Looney cartoon.
Right, let's see if we
Can you see it?
can. Hang on. Yep.
Okay, so you've got these three guys sitting around, and they say, so here we are, three different cultural backgrounds, Scotch, Xavier and Geelong Grammar, all working together for the common good. How lovely. Gentlemen, here's to multiculturalism.
Right.